It's a cold December morning in 2004, Sacramento, California. A quiet neighborhood, a house that looks like any other. But inside, a story was ending that had once shaken the entire US government. Gary Webb, the reporter who exposed the CIA's darkest secret, was found dead. 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The police said he took his own life, and that single word opened 1,000 questions. Because really, who shoots themselves twice? The details were strange. His motorcycle parts laid out neatly on a workbench. His social security card was left beside a handwritten note that said, "Please do not enter. Call 911. It looked too deliberate, too calm for a man supposedly at the end of his rope. Yet that's what the report said. But for those who knew Gary Webb and for anyone who knew what he had exposed, that explanation never sat right. Just 9 days before his death, Gary had told a friend he was onto something again, something big. He didn't say what, he didn't have to. Everyone who followed his work knew the kind of stories he chased, the kind that made powerful people sweat. Gary Webb was the kind of journalist who treated every lead like a moral duty. His friends used to say he had this stubborn look, the kind that told you he wouldn't let go of a story until it either broke him or broke the world open. To understand why his death hit so hard, you have to know the man first. Gary grew up as the son of a Marine. That meant constant moving, base to base, state to state, never staying long enough to feel settled. It taught him early that authority wasn't always right, and that people in power often acted like they were untouchable. That sense of skepticism never left him. By 19, he was living in Ohio, writing for his college paper, The Northerner. He didn't care much for campus gossip or sports recaps. He went after stories that questioned rules, that challenged institutions. That attitude carried him straight into his first real job, working for the Kentucky Post and later the Cleveland Plain Dealer. This was the 1970s, a time when newspapers still had real muscle. Gary became known for one thing: exposing corruption. Cops who abused power, judges who took bribes, politicians who thought they could hide their mess. And maybe that's what made him dangerous, because the same drive that made him great also made him reckless, at least by newsroom standards. By the mid-1980s, Gary had moved back to California. He joined the San Jose Mercury News, a small regional paper far from the national spotlight. Most reporters there covered tech stories or local politics, but Gary wanted the kind of stories that could shake the system. And he found them, first in local corruption, then in the government's so-called war on drugs. He saw how the war was being sold to the public as a fight for safety. But on the streets, it looked like something else entirely. Poor neighborhoods getting torn apart. Families losing homes under new drug laws that let police seize property before anyone was even convicted. It felt wrong, not just morally, but structurally. The more he looked, the more it smelled like something bigger was happening. Something organized. Then came the call that changed everything. A woman reached out to Gary after reading one of his stories. Her boyfriend, she said, had been arrested for drug trafficking. The police had taken his property before the trial even started. She insisted he'd been set up. Normally reporters would brush it off, but Gary didn't. He decided to look into it. That one decision pulled him into a maze of connections he could never have imagined. A maze that led straight from the neighborhoods of Los Angeles to the jungles of Central America, and from small-time dealers to the highest levels of US intelligence. In time, this would become the story that made him famous, and the story that destroyed him. He met with this woman, and soon after, her boyfriend's lawyer handed over a pile of court documents. At first, it looked like just another drug case. Cocaine trafficking, gang ties, standard stuff for 1980s California. But buried in the paperwork were strange names, foreign names and references to something called contra funding. That was odd. The Contras were Nicaraguan rebels backed by the US government, fighting to overthrow the left-wing Sandinista regime in Central America. But what did a California drug dealer have to do with a war in Nicaragua? That question pulled Webb down a rabbit hole that would consume the next decade of his life. He started piecing together how drug money in American cities was being funneled, sometimes literally, into weapons and supplies for the Contras. It sounded insane, even to him. The idea that cocaine sold in Los Angeles could be helping fund a CIA-backed war thousands of miles away. It was the kind of thing people whispered about, not wrote about. But Webb's gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. Every lead seemed to connect two worlds that were never supposed to touch: the streets of South Central LA and the jungles of Central America. The more he looked, the more he realized this wasn't a local story anymore. It was something global. He started calling old contacts from his earlier reporting days, trying to trace who these Nicaraguan figures were. Some of them turned out to be exiled military men with rumored links to US intelligence. Others were middlemen who handled both drugs and money with the same cold efficiency. Webb's notes grew thicker. He was following phone records, financial transfers, even flight manifests. And the deeper he went, the stranger it got. Names that kept showing up in CIA reports also showed up in DEA investigations. Informants who were supposed to be working against drug traffickers were secretly helping them move shipments north. It was a spider web of alliances that no one in Washington wanted to talk about. Inside the newsroom, Webb's editors were supportive but wary. They told him to be careful, to double-check everything, to avoid jumping to conclusions. But Webb wasn't guessing. He had documents, witnesses, and court testimony. What started as a favor to a desperate woman had become the beginning of a story that would shake the foundations of American journalism. Still, he couldn't shake a strange feeling, that invisible line he'd just crossed. In the past, his investigations had taken down corrupt officials or shady cops. But this was the CIA. These were the people who operated above the law, hidden behind national security. The kind of people who could erase your name if they wanted to. Every day in the newsroom, Webb seemed quieter, more focused. His colleagues noticed the shift. They said he started to look like someone who'd glimpsed a monster too big to fight. But he didn't stop. Curiosity had turned into dread, but also conviction. The trail that started with one frightened woman's phone call now led Gary Webb to a name he'd never heard before: Danilo Blandon. On paper, Blandon looked ordinary enough. A Nicaraguan immigrant who'd fled his country during the revolution, moved to California, and started a new life. But when Webb began digging into court records, the truth came out like a punch to the gut. Blandon was one of the biggest cocaine suppliers in Los Angeles during the early 1980s. What made it even stranger was how open Blandon was about it. In sworn court testimony, he admitted everything. How he'd sold tons of cocaine to Los Angeles street dealers. How he'd made millions. And most importantly, why he did it. Blandon said he wasn't just dealing for himself. He was raising money for the Contras, a rebel army fighting in Nicaragua. That name again? The Contras. Webb had heard it before in passing while researching the drug case, but now it was front and center. The Contras were directly backed by the US government, trained and supplied by the CIA, and publicly supported by President Ronald Reagan, who called them freedom fighters. So here was the contradiction. On one hand, the US government was waging a moral war against drugs. On the other, a key figure in its proxy war against communism was admitting under oath that he sold cocaine to fund that very war. That was the first red flag, and Webb couldn't ignore it. He started pulling every document, every transcript, every scrap of evidence he could find on Blandon. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. Blandon had arrived in the US as a well-connected exile. He wasn't living in poverty. He had political ties, money, and a mission. And soon after arriving, he began working closely with another man, a Nicaraguan named Norin Meneses, known among law enforcement as the king of drugs in Central America. Meneses was no small-time hustler. He was a heavyweight, a man who could move cocaine across borders with military precision. And according to DEA reports, Blandon and Meneses were deeply involved in supplying crack cocaine to one of LA's most notorious street dealers, Freeway Rick Ross. Ross wasn't famous yet, but his operation would soon become a nationwide phenomenon. He bought his drugs in bulk from Blandon, cooked them into crack, and sold them through networks that reached every neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles. At the height of it, Ross was moving hundreds of kilos a week. Blandon was his direct supplier, and the profits were staggering. To understand how, Webb had to go back to Washington. In 1982, Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, a law that banned the US government from giving direct aid to the Contras. The CIA's funding stream dried up overnight. But the Reagan administration wasn't willing to give up the fight. They needed another way to keep the money flowing. That's when the off-the-books operations began. Private networks, arms dealers, foreign intermediaries, and, as Blandon's story suggested, drug money. Cocaine was the perfect currency. High demand, easy to move, impossible to trace. Webb's reporting began to tie all these threads together. On one side were US-backed rebels fighting in the jungles of Nicaragua. On the other were crack dealers fueling addiction and chaos in American cities. The bridge between them, the same supply chain. The more Webb connected the dots, the more chilling it became. He found government memos acknowledging the CIA's relationship with contra commanders known to be involved in drug trafficking. He found that US officials had been warned repeatedly, but chose to look away. The official line was always the same. The agency didn't control the Contra's actions, but Webb saw through it. Meanwhile, on the ground in Los Angeles, the damage was catastrophic. Crack had turned whole neighborhoods into war zones. Addiction rates soared, families collapsed, and police were locking up users and dealers by the thousands, mostly young black men, while the people supplying them operated under the quiet protection of US intelligence. Blandon, in particular, seemed untouchable. When DEA agents finally arrested him in the early 1990s, they expected a major conviction. Instead, he served a short sentence, then walked free after agreeing to become an informant. Even stranger, the same government that once backed the Contras now paid Blandon as a witness in other drug cases. It was a surreal twist. The man who'd helped flood Los Angeles with cocaine was now working for the US government. Webb couldn't let that go. To verify it, Webb traced flight paths, shipping records, and intelligence reports. He uncovered connections between known drug smugglers and companies that doubled as CIA contractors. Planes used to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua were sometimes carrying cocaine back to the US. As Webb pieced this together, the atmosphere around him grew tense. His phone calls started getting stranger, people hanging up when he answered, unfamiliar voices asking what he was working on. He told friends he could feel something watching over his shoulder, though he couldn't prove what. Still, he kept going. Through documents, flight records, and witness testimony, Webb uncovered a network so large and organised it could rival any government operation. Blandon's suppliers weren't just local smugglers. They were connected to Contra commanders and ex-military figures stretching across Central America, Honduras, Costa Rica, El Salvador, men who once fought alongside the US to push back communism. Cocaine flowed north, money flowed south, and weapons went back with the planes. Every flight served three purposes: delivery, deposit, and destruction. Cocaine came into California through a maze of small airports and private runways. The profits were laundered, often through businesses that looked legitimate on the surface. Import-export companies, real estate fronts, even churches. Then the cash moved quietly down to Central America, funding the Contras' war effort. Webb mapped it out in his notes. Miami, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Three main hubs. Each one had its own network of traffickers, distributors, and handlers. But the center of gravity was Los Angeles. That's where the crack epidemic exploded. And at the center of that explosion stood Freeway Rick Ross. Ross was smart, disciplined, and frighteningly business-minded. He treated drug dealing like logistics, efficiency, consistency, expansion. He bought in bulk, cut costs, and reinvested profits. And Blandon was his golden supplier. Through Blandon, Ross was getting cocaine at prices no one else could touch. High purity, low cost, steady supply. The deeper Webb went, the clearer the pattern became. When one route shut down, another opened. When one supplier got caught, another took over. The network never truly stopped. It adapted, evolved, re-emerged. And always behind the scenes there were hints of protection. Cases quietly dropped, informants mysteriously freed, and files sealed for national security reasons. Webb found DEA reports from the 1980s that mentioned Contra-connected traffickers by name. He found memos showing that US officials had known for years that cocaine profits were funding the rebels. Yet every time investigators tried to follow the money, someone higher up told them to back off. In one Senate hearing from the late 80s, a former DEA agent testified that shipments tied to contra groups were being protected from prosecution. Another government memo admitted that certain traffickers were considered assets because they were helpful to US interests. The whole system worked because no one was supposed to connect the dots. The street dealers never met the smugglers never met the handlers, and the handlers always had paperwork proving they were on official business. As Webb followed the paper trail, the details grew almost unbelievable. In one case, federal agents raided a warehouse connected to a contra operative and found large sums of cash that were later released back to the suspect for reasons unknown. In another, a known smuggler was granted a visa and allowed to travel freely, despite pending charges. By the time Webb finished mapping the pipeline, disbelief had turned into outrage. The evidence was right there, scattered across agencies and archives, waiting for someone brave enough to connect it all. That someone was him. But uncovering it was one thing. Publishing it and proving it to the world would be another battle entirely. Because what Gary Webb was about to reveal would shake the country, enrage the intelligence community, and put a target squarely on his back. When Webb finally published his 3-part series titled Dark Alliance, it set the country on fire. It dropped in August 1996 in the San Jose Mercury News, a paper that wasn't exactly a national heavyweight. But the story it carried was pure dynamite. The series didn't rely on whispers or theories. Webb had DEA reports, court documents, and sworn testimony from informants. He even published a diagram tracing the cash. The timing couldn't have been more explosive. By the mid-90s, the US was still reeling from the damage of the crack epidemic. Broken families, overflowing prisons, entire neighborhoods torn apart. For years, people in south-central LA had suspected the drugs didn't just appear out of nowhere. Now a respected journalist was saying, "You're right, they didn't." And Webb didn't just publish in print, he went digital. The Mercury News put Dark Alliance on the early internet, a move that changed journalism forever. The site had mugshots, scanned memos, flowcharts, even links to court transcripts. It was interactive before anyone used that word. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Servers crashed, emails flooded in, and the story spread faster than any traditional newspaper could keep up with. For the first time, everyday people could read classified-style evidence straight from their home computers. In South Central, the reaction was explosive. Churches held emergency meetings. Community leaders demanded action. Protesters marched with signs that read, "CIA equals crack in America." Even celebrities and activists stepped in. Dick Gregory, Jesse Jackson, and Maxine Waters publicly called for investigations. Television couldn't stay quiet. CNN, ABC, and local stations in LA all ran segments showing angry crowds, community meetings, and old footage from the crack years. For Webb, it was surreal. One moment he was a local reporter buried in paperwork. The next, his face was on national TV. He'd pulled off something every journalist dreams of, a story that shakes the system. The Mercury News basked in the attention too. Their small newsroom suddenly became the centre of the media universe. It felt like a victory, like truth had finally broken through the walls. But even as the story caught fire, Webb knew the storm was coming. He'd taken on the CIA, and that wasn't something the establishment would forgive easily. Still, in those first few weeks, the energy was electric. Webb was invited to speak at town halls across the country. He met grieving parents who thanked him for giving them answers. He saw how his story had turned conspiracy whispers into national debate. Inside Langley, the agency's public affairs office reportedly went into full panic mode. Internal memos show they drafted talking points to help deflect criticism. They reached out quietly to friendly journalists in major outlets, urging them to check the facts and put things in perspective. But for now, the people weren't listening to excuses. They were too busy asking why their government had turned a blind eye to a drug epidemic that destroyed generations. As protests grew, more lawmakers demanded answers. The pressure got so intense that CIA Director John Deutsch did something unheard of. He flew to South Central Los Angeles to face the public. And that was all because of Gary Webb. One reporter with a stack of notes and a stubborn belief that the truth mattered. The Dark Alliance series had done what no one thought possible. It made the CIA answer to the streets. For a brief shining moment, Webb was a hero. The story had cracked open something ugly and hidden, and for the first time America was forced to look. Webb didn't know it yet, but the same machine that praised him today would soon turn on him tomorrow. The applause didn't last long. After Dark Alliance blew up, Gary Webb went from being celebrated as a fearless reporter to being treated like a reckless one. The story that had electrified America was now being picked apart word by word by the biggest news organizations in the country. At first, it seemed like every journalist wanted to be Gary Webb, the guy who exposed what everyone else was too scared to touch. But within weeks, that excitement twisted into something darker. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, the three biggest names in American journalism, all published stories discrediting him. Suddenly, Webb was the reporter who went too far. They said his reporting was thinly sourced, oversimplified, and misled readers. But most of all, they said he couldn't prove that the CIA ordered anyone to sell drugs. That was the trick. Webb had never claimed that. He never wrote that the CIA gave direct orders to flood black neighborhoods with crack. What he did show was that drug traffickers, working with US-backed contra rebels, were allowed to operate freely, while the government looked the other way. It was about complicity, not command. But nuance doesn't survive in headlines. The phrase CIA linked to crack epidemic was too shocking, too heavy, and too dangerous. The narrative flipped, and the same outlets that had ignored the story for years now united to bury it. And it worked. Inside the San Jose Mercury News, things got even worse. His editors, who had proudly stood by him during the release, suddenly changed their tune. Under pressure from the national backlash, they started walking back their own reporting. And then without warning, they publicly apologized. Not to Webb, but to the readers and the CIA. That apology broke him. Webb had spent over a year chasing leads no one else would touch. He'd risked his safety, his career, even his sanity, to piece together the truth. And now his own paper was acting like he'd made it all up. The editors who had signed off on every word were pretending they'd been misled. Behind the scenes, things got even scarier. Webb's sources, the people who had once helped him uncover the network, began vanishing. Some stopped answering calls, others said they couldn't talk anymore. A few moved away, leaving no trace. The ones who did speak sounded terrified. Webb could feel the wall closing in. Government agencies denied everything. The CIA said there was no evidence of its involvement. The Justice Department said the allegations were not credible. And every time an official statement came out, another major newspaper amplified it, not by questioning, but by repeating it as truth. Webb was watching his own reporting be dismantled by the same institutions he had spent his career exposing. At first, he tried to defend himself. He gave interviews, released documents, and calmly explained that his story had been twisted. But it didn't matter. The label had stuck. To most people reading the headlines, Webb was now the paranoid reporter chasing shadows. In private, friends said he started growing quieter, paranoid even. He felt followed at times, convinced his phone was tapped. His wife noticed his unease. He'd been a confident, almost cocky reporter, and now he was tense, withdrawn, and angry. He knew what was happening wasn't random. It was coordinated. The same big newspapers that had ignored CIA scandals for years were now acting like the agency's cleanup crew. And while the media tore him apart, the Mercury News left him hanging. They reassigned him to a small suburban bureau 2 hours from his home, a humiliating demotion that was designed to make him quit. One by one, the people who had praised him went silent. Conferences stopped inviting him. Journalists who had once asked for advice now avoided him. His name became radioactive. He'd been erased from the story he started. The worst part was that his evidence was never disproven. Not once. Every official inquiry that followed admitted there were connections between drug traffickers and contra groups. Even CIA Inspector General reports later confirmed it, just not in the explosive way Webb had written it. But by then it didn't matter. His career was already dead. December 10th, 2004. A quiet Friday morning in Carmichael, California. Inside a small rental house on a suburban street, Gary Webb is found dead. The man who once took on the CIA, who spent years fighting to clear his name, is discovered with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The The news hits fast but not hard enough. A short blurb runs in local papers. Reporter Gary Webb took his own life. That's it. No national coverage, no outrage. Just a few paragraphs to mark the end of one of the most controversial journalists of his time. But then the details start to spread. The internet, still young and wild in 2004, catches fire. Forums explode with posts. Bloggers ask the question everyone's thinking. But no one in power dares to say out loud, how do you shoot yourself twice in the head? The police stand by their statement. They say Webb used a .38 revolver. The first shot entered his face but didn't kill him. The second one did. Investigators insist it happens more often than people think, that it's not impossible for someone to pull the trigger twice out of panic, hesitation, or pain. The coroner's report backs it up. The evidence, they say, is clear. But not everyone's buying it. Within days, theories start to pile up. Some claim Webb was silenced, that someone didn't want him talking. Others think he'd uncovered something new, something bigger than Dark Alliance. A few even claim he'd reached out to contacts again, digging into another operation that linked government agencies to covert wars overseas. And there's one detail that keeps the fire burning. 9 days before his death, Webb told a former colleague he was about to go public with something bigger. He didn't say what it was, he didn't leave notes about it. But people close to him remember him sounding determined, almost energized. So when news breaks that he's dead, it feels off, too sudden, too clean. But amid all the speculation, his family steps forward. His ex-wife Susan says he'd been struggling with depression. His finances were in ruins. He'd been evicted from his home, living with his mother. He'd just sold his motorcycle and was looking for steady work. The rejection, the ridicule, and the years of professional exile had worn him down. They confirm he left multiple notes, one for each of his children, one for his ex-wife, and one for his mother. He'd updated his will days before he died. And yet even with that confirmation, something about it doesn't sit right. The image of Gary Webb, the man who exposed the CIA's ties to drug traffickers, dying alone, with 2 bullets to the head, just doesn't fit the way most people wanted his story to end. It feels unfinished. It feels like someone pressed stop before the reel was done. Two years pass. The world moves on. But the name Gary Webb refuses to stay buried. In 2006, a journalist named Nick Sco published Kill the Messenger. It's a deep dive into the scandal, the smear campaign, and the quiet power structure that destroyed Webb's career. For the first time since his death, someone puts the pieces back together. Sco's book reignites the story. It gives Webb's work new context, new evidence, and a new generation of readers who never got to see how brutally he was taken down. And then years later, Hollywood steps in. In 2014, the film Kill the Messenger hits theaters. Jeremy Renner plays Gary Webb, not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as a flawed, relentless reporter who refused to stop asking questions. The movie doesn't glorify him, it humanizes him. It shows the pressure, the fear, the loneliness, the real cost of chasing the truth in a world built on denial. The film forces audiences to confront what the country tried to forget, that the so-called war on drugs was a war against communities. The crack epidemic didn't vanish. It evolved. The policies born out of that era, mandatory minimums, mass incarceration, and 3 strikes laws still haunt the US today. Families were destroyed. Generations were lost. Whole neighborhoods were written off. And it all started with the same government that promised to protect its people. After the film, interest in Webb's work explodes online. People start sharing his old articles, his interviews, his notes. Young journalists cite him as the reason they got into investigative reporting. Professors teach Dark Alliance in media ethics classes as a case study, not just in courage, but in betrayal. And that quote, the one he borrowed from Oscar Wilde, becomes his lasting echo. The truth is rarely pure and never simple. So the real question isn't how Gary Webb died, it's what else he found before he did.